Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. On this week's episode of the show, I welcome Max Kuhn. Max is the author of the new book, Tidy Models with Julia Silge. Now, if you're a listener of the show, you may have listened to that episode with Julia just a few weeks ago. Julia really didn't want to talk about her new book, which is amazing. She wanted to just move on to the next thing that she's working on at RStudio, which is great. But I want to talk more about tidy models, so I reached out to Max to see if he would like to talk about the book. So we do talk about the book, and we talk about tidy models, and we talk about a lot of the other fascinating things that he's working on at RStudio. We also talk about his background in the pharmaceutical area and how he moved into R and into RStudio. There's a lot to learn here. There's a lot of great links in the show notes that I've included if you want to explore some of these different packages and explore Max's GitHub page, where he's got a lot of information, a lot of code, a lot of resources for you. So this is a really interesting episode, a really interesting discussion. And if you are an R programmer, this is the episode for you. Now, before I turn you over to that interview, I'm excited to let you know that I have a sponsor for the podcast. That's right. Partner Hero is sponsoring this and several more podcasts coming up. So let me tell you a little bit about them before I let you go on to the next thing, because I think if you are a freelancer, if you're a small business owner, if you're working in the data viz field, Partner Hero might have the right solution for you. Partner Hero is a customer service outsourcing firm. They have flexible terms. They'll help you scale quickly. They have quality assurance programs baked right into the tool, and they have offices all around the world, which of course is really important. Now, I've used lots of different outsourcing tools and platforms to do some of my work. Maybe I need someone to help me scrape something off the web. Maybe I need someone to help me write something or clean something up. And they're all fine. They have some pros and cons. Some of the user interfaces aren't great, this and that. The thing that I like most about Partner Hero is that they are really emphasizing values. And they are values aligned and trying to change the outsourcing industry, because there is so much work out there where people are being exploited, people are being taken advantage of, and Partner Hero is really focusing on that. So if you are a small business owner, or if you're a freelancer, generally, if you're just ready to bring in outside customer support help for your startup that feels like it's part of your existing team, I recommend you check out Partner Hero. So head on over to partnerhero.com/PolicyViz to book a free consultation with their solutions team. Mention you heard about Partner Hero from PolicyViz, and they'll waive the setup fee. So that's partnerhero.com/PolicyViz to check out Partner Hero's outsourcing firm. So with no further ado, let's check out the interview with Max Kuhn from RStudio. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. Hey, Max. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm well. How are
I'm
you
good.
doing?
And you've got a friend behind you.
Yeah, that is my new puppy, Kaladin. He's 6 months old. I've had him for like 2 weeks, and he's like the platonic idea of a good boy.
He's literally Max's best friend.
Yeah, so far.
He's just chewing on one of those rubber things with the peanut butter in it.
Yep.
Good. Enjoying it. Well, thanks for coming on the show. You have this new book out on that I'm excited about, which I am just checking out now. And there's a lot in there. So I want to get to that. But I wanted to start with your background, because like a lot of folks who come on the show working in data and data visualization, it's not like a direct line to where they are now. And you have an interesting background. So I was curious if you could just talk about yourself, so folks know a little bit more about you, how you got where you started and how you ended up at RStudio.
Yeah, so I'm a biostatistician. So I have a PhD in that. I worked for about 6 years in Baltimore for a company doing molecular diagnostics. That was a lot of like traditional nonclinical statistical work, like designing and analyzing experiments, and then doing some algorithm work for the instruments. And then I went into drug discovery for about 12 years, again, doing like the early research, sciencey stuff, and did a lot of modeling and experimentation, things like that. Really enjoyed it. So yeah, when I left there, it was like a little bit of push, a little bit of pull. I was not thrilled with working for a huge corporation, which maybe goals were maybe not in alignment with mine. And the scientists I work with and the work I did, I loved,
Yeah.
and I really, really enjoyed all that. But it was kind of like, I think I'd reached my period of like, yeah, I need a new
Right.
job. And so there was a little bit of like, yeah, I should look for something else. But a big part of it was when JJ Lair and Hadley Wickham were like, hey, we're going to be doing some more stuff with R. Would you like to work on modeling software? And I was like, yeah. So in like the first week or two of working in discovery, I had some ideas on an R package. So this is like 2005, and there weren't many. R was a very heterogeneous environment, it still is, for modeling. And so I wrote this package called Caret, which was mostly used internally for a year or two for computational biology and chemistry. Um, but it was like something that would unify a lot of the disparate interfaces and things like that in R, and also had a lot of functions that didn't really exist. Like if you wanted to calculate sensitivity and specificity, it just weren't
Right.
functions. Um, and with that, and I was working on a book on modeling, and that was going pretty well. It was like a little pet project that kind of blew up
Yeah.
on me, and I was like, holy smokes, now people are using it. And then the company was like, yeah, I know we like allocated some time for you to do that, but you're kind of on your own now for doing that. So with Caret, I love it. I'm happy so many people have used it and have gotten a lot out of it, but it maybe wasn't designed as time went by very well, because it was like something I was doing in my spare time.
Gotcha.
So it didn't really have much potential for, I mean, it's got a lot of stuff in it, but it wasn't very extensible. And so, when they say like, hey, what would you do if you could spend all day writing modeling software? And I was like, well, I'd kind of start over. There's a lot we learned about interfaces to models since then, especially with Hadley and all the stuff he's done with the tidyverse and ggplot, things like that. So yeah, so there was a very enticing offer to be paid full time to write data analysis software and start over and work with a lot of really good people who know a lot of really good stuff
Right.
and let things evolve.
So
Yeah.
so did you go to RStudio in 2005?
I think it was 2016.
Oh, okay.
No, 2005 was when I started in drug
Oh, okay.
discovery.
Okay. So you've been at
Yeah.
RStudio now for about 7-8 years, something like that. 6, 7, yeah.
Six-ish. It was like the end of
16. Okay.
2016, I
Yeah.
think.
I mean, that's really interesting.
Thereabout.
So then you get to RStudio, and is that when where does tidy models come from in your origin story, as it were?
Yeah, I thought about like different components of what I would want to do next. I thought, like when it happened really weird that I happened to be in New York the same day that they were in New York, and they knew I was in Connecticut. So like, hey, could you come to New York? And I'm like, what street do you live? And so like we actually sat down on like a whiteboard and outlined some stuff. And I originally had been thinking about what became the recipes package, which I'm like really particularly proud of. Recipes is a sort of like a combination of dplyr and R's formula method. And what that means, if you're not familiar with those, is you could very quickly have a very expressive sequential way of pre-processing your data prior to modeling or doing feature engineering or feature extraction, and allow you to do things that you couldn't necessarily do with R's traditional modeling tools. And so, and that's very, very much influenced by the, pipeable functions and dplyr and things like that. So, we kind of thought about that, and that was sort of like the first little bit of it. I'd read R for Data Science and some things that Hadley was doing in there that didn't really persist beyond that, but the way that he stored like resampling information, stuff like that, eventually became R sample, sort of like a beefed up version of that. And so these little pieces sort of came together. What do we do about having a better interface to models? And there were things I definitely learned with Caret, like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And, it became a little bit more complicated way of doing things behind the scenes. But in the end, I think it's a lot simpler for, well, I think at least it's a lot simpler for people to use. So it was just sort of like, yeah, and I remember the first time, like right when I started was like the first RStudio conference. And somebody asked Hadley on stage, like, what's Max going to be working on? And he said, like, modeling. And they're like, oh, what kind? He's like, all of it. And I'm literally sitting, Jenny Brad and I had just met because we kind of started the same place. We're sitting next to each other. And I was like, shit. Pardon me. How clean this podcast is. But but it's very
Yeah.
open ended, and thankfully it still is. And and they trusted me enough to say like, all right, well, let's give him a hand when he needs it. Like we usually talk a lot about
Hmm.
interfaces and naming things and like what's a good way of
Yeah.
doing things.
What
So a lot
I,
of
I want to ask
yeah.
what drew you to R in the first place, as opposed to, I mean, I don't know any of the biostats packages. I'm sure there's a ton of them, but like what drew you to R?
Well, I'm going to date myself. I was in graduate school in the 90s. So basically, your two choices there for statistical analysis was SAS and S
Right.
plus. There was
Right.
no R, and and SAS was what people were being taught. It became very clear to me that you're very limited in what you
Hmm.
can do. I mean, the reason I went into non-clinical statistics was the nature of that kind of job is you have like hundreds of customers doing many different things that don't have any predefined
Hmm.
analysis. So somebody comes to you with some new laboratory test that they're working on that produces some really funky type of output, and it's your job to translate that into some numbers. And I always gravitated to problems like that. So I felt having something very like it's going to sound bad. I don't mean it to be bad, but like a superficial sort of
Hmm.
programming language like SAS, it's not very
Hmm.
expressive. And so in graduate school, I saw S plus. And I was like, all right, this
Right.
is nice. Um, and so eventually S plus sort
Yeah.
of petered out when R came online. And so R for me, I mean, it sounds like a silly thing to say now because we're so um, used to having actual programming
Yeah.
languages to work with. But in the mid 90s, that wasn't
Right.
really the case. And so, having something where you had scoping and functions and data types and that was like it was like, yeah, I can do anything I
Hmm.
want to here. So, I mean, I think in the language wars in data science, I think most of it's based on where you
Yeah.
started. And it's not like I've never used Python
Yeah.
or anything like that, but R, I really do believe that R, clearly biased, but like the S language in R is really based for people whose fundamental thinking process is about interactive data
Hmm.
analysis,
Yeah.
right? So it's built from literally from the ground up with
Yeah.
that in mind, which is not again a knock against any other programming language. But if you're asking me like what I feel makes it click with me, it's like, oh, there's some things that could look really kludgy to outside people, but they're really nice in terms of the context of
Yeah.
what you're doing in R. So contextually, you can call it like a DSL or domain specific language and something like that. Um, but I like it for what
Yeah.
it does. I wouldn't use it to like do my
No, no, no.
taxes,
Right.
but for
Right.
data analysis,
Yeah.
it's
For the tools.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And um, I guess I don't know enough about the history of R, to be perfectly honest, but the movement from base R into using a GUI like RStudio. I don't even know what my question is here, I guess, but like, how did that? Maybe the question is, how did that change your maybe your workflow, or the way, or maybe it didn't, or how you think about using the tool when it has more of this space that's a little bit, well, I don't know, this is probably true, right? Just use more user friendly.
So I think there's like two aspects of that are worth talking about. And first is
Hmm.
syntax. And you know, people are still arguing about this. Being like an S person, back in the day, when I first started using it, I remember sitting in my office, and this is in Richmond, Virginia, in the basement of the medical building, and saying like, "Where's the damn inverse function? I just need to invert
Right.
this matrix, right?" And it's solve. It's a solve function without adding the
Yeah.
extra argument. And I'm like, what the hell? Or like the
Hmm.
sort function, I want to sort a data frame, and no, you
Yeah.
can't really do that. You have to use subscripting with the order function. And so it's really efficient and does some good things. I mean, it
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of good things, but it's not really written in terms of like I could figure that out. I have a PhD in statistics and done all this stuff. But if you're, I've worked with like a lot of bench scientists, and I've worked with a lot of people who's don't have any training in data analysis or statistics or
Right.
computer science. And I think that things like the tidyverse are born out of that. Like there's some just low hanging fruit about let's name things better. Let's give them arguments that, and then you consider like the pipe, the Magritte pipe, or now the
Yeah.
base R pipe, and start designing code for that. People are still arguing about this, but I feel like for the average user, it's far and away better to be using, you know, assuming you're inside the scope of what, let's say, the tidyverse or associated things do. It's a much
Yeah.
nicer place to live. So on the syntax side, I think that's a good answer. I think the sort of tidyverse gets a lot of press, but I think the thing for me as a developer, and this translates to the average user too, is the tool sets are
Hmm.
so good. They're so good. Like the RStudio editor, like the IDE, the tooling around almost everything it just
Right.
can't be better. And so the thing I've learned over the years is, it's not that you need really, really good tools to be great at something, but man, does it make your life so much better. Like I can't imagine doing package management without the tools that the people inside of
Hmm.
RStudio build. Think about users, like in terms of like importing data. um, the tools are largely, I think a lot of the tools I'm talking about are really born out of RStudio. Here's a good example: is Jenny Bryan has spent a lot of time working
Hmm.
on spreadsheets. She's this brilliant person, and I think she recognizes, like, yeah, all that fancy statistics is great, but if people can't get their
Yeah.
data in,
Right.
like, why are we
Right.
doing? And I remember talking to her about spreadsheets, and she and I had this sort of shared miserable experience of having people. So in biology, most genes there's different ways to reference genes, but for humans, there's this thing called the Hugo ID, which is usually a
Hmm.
couple of letters. Like interleukin 18 is
Hmm.
IL-18. And I had this experience where people, like external collaborators, would give data in an Excel file. And then we tried to read it in, we would eventually convert to CSV for the
Yeah.
systems we had. And then eventually it goes back into Excel, or, have these
Right.
back and forths. And it might take a Hugo ID like SEP 12 and think, oh, that's
Oh, yeah,
September
sure.
12th. And so it converts that cell to a date. And then when you save it as a CSV file, it converts that as an
Right.
integer from some reference date. And so, like, you're looking at this spreadsheet that's got maybe like 20,000 things in it. You're like, why is this wrong
Right.
number there? And then a day or two later of you figuring this out, you're like, holy shit,
That was a date.
that was a,
Right.
got converted back and forth. And having
Yeah.
tools that don't do that, I mean, it sounds silly, but like, that's what I mean is, like, you end up fighting
Yeah.
the process so much if you
Yeah.
don't have good tooling. And our Markdown,
Hmm.
Shiny, and now Quarto, it's so fundamentally, like, I'm kind of jealous of people now is they don't have
Yeah.
to
Fight that.
live with the shared pain that,
Yeah.
we had before. Like, and even think about GitHub. I was using uh CVS and really old version,
Yeah.
version control, and
Yeah.
wow,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
No,
don't
I
want to sound
know,
like
but
old
some of
man,
those,
but
even
like,
some of those,
I,
like
the tooling
some of those,
matters
like
is, yeah.
those one that the version control software that you'd have to purchase were just like they were just not very good, and just hard to use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the notion of needing it
Yeah.
for data analysis. A scientist or a statistician and I were meeting with some other statisticians, and we were talking to them about using version control. Like, oh, we don't
Yeah.
need that. And the person I was with, his name was Jim Rogers, said, he said it in not a condescending way, but he basically said, "You do, you
Yeah.
just
Right.
don't know yet.
Right.
You just haven't
Yeah.
lost something that you
Yeah.
wish you
Right.
had." And then when you do, remember, I'm like three doors down, and
That's
I'll
right. Right.
evangelize the
Right.
gospel of
Right.
version control.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you have let's pivot a bit. So you have a new book out with Julia Silge, who was on the show a few months ago. Um, so it's I sort of noted as like a review of the code syntax behind tidy models, but it's not really a review. It's more of like a step by step. But it also is kind of a primer on regressions and modeling. And so I'm curious, like, let's start with, so it seemed like there's these two pieces. And so did you set out to have these two pieces? Like, not just going to give you a step by step in this particular coding language, which is kind of what like Hadley's R for Data Science book does. But yours is more of like, I think you could sort of think about it as like an intro stats textbook with doing it in R. Like, was that the idea?
I don't know that we thought it out like that. I think the problem we have, assuming it's a problem, is that when we want to teach any of this, whether it's in a workshop
Yeah.
or in a book or whatever, it's very hard to be like, and here's how you do resampling. And people are
Right.
like, well,
Yeah.
what's resampling, right? So you have to front load all this information about, like, what's a
Yeah.
training set, what's a test set. And we're usually writing for people who are not
Hmm.
experts at this. Again, like, we're not writing for ourselves. We're writing for people who work at a bank, and their boss is like, hey, I read this thing, go do a linear regression. We're like, what's a linear regression, right? And so, like, so,
Right.
people just don't know. And so a lot of times we want to talk about the syntax of what we're doing, even if it's something that's not particularly fancy. We do have to sort of talk about the nomenclature, and the nomenclature leads a little bit into like,
Mm-hmm.
well, why would I do that? Like, why would I
Mm-hmm.
save some
Yeah.
data as a test set? And so it's really, I don't think we'd ever be successful in teaching anything if we were like, and here's how you do
Right.
a random forest without telling you what a
Right.
random forest, to some extent, telling you what a random forest is. So I don't think there's any other way to do it. I mean, unless you're looking at like a pure like statistics or
Mm-hmm.
machine learning type of book where there's no syntax
Yeah.
or application, I think you kind of have to do them hand in hand, or otherwise it doesn't really benefit anybody. And the problem with me sometimes is like just stopping myself from going on.
Right.
And what's the minimum
Yeah.
amount that makes sense? And there's plenty of things I would like for them to know, but hey, this is a book
Right.
on modeling software,
Right.
so let's not worry about you know
Well,
stuff
also
like
the thing that's
other
interesting
things.
is I think about like your book compared with like Hadley's book. Hadley's book starts with data visualization, right? And I don't know why he did that. My guess is that because with data visualization, when you start with ggplot, you get something right. You can see your success right away, right? You don't have to, cleaning is kind
Yes.
of boring, it's not like, and you get this success right away. And so, how did you and Julia sort of think about did you think about that? You're like, just someone who's going to read this book is someone who's going to be interested in modeling and learning this, and we have to sort of think about that much of a setup.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like if they were reading
Mm-hmm.
that book, they have a reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, all right, I've heard of this, or maybe I haven't heard of it, but or I haven't used it, but like I know of its
Yeah.
existence. What does it do? We don't really. A lot of times in training materials in some books, we do this like what we call or what's called the whole game, where we give them a little introductory chapter that's like not very in depth, but gives them a roadmap of like, hey, here's an
Mm-hmm.
analysis and what's happened, and then we'll go through this in detail later. We didn't really do that with this book. We kind of approached it from the standpoint of the first parts of being like
Mm-hmm.
about our philosophy, like why
Yeah.
why would I care about this? Like what sell me on why this is important or
Yeah.
I should spend time with this. And then we went a little bit into like, well, why aren't you
Yeah.
using base R? And then from there, it kind of proceeds in terms of like how
Mm-hmm.
you would do your analysis. So we talk about like, a little bit about exploratory data analysis. We talk about data splitting because
Mm-hmm.
those are the first things you do. And then talk about like your first model and then, eventually, worm your way through to measuring performance and tuning models. And then there's a bunch of just assorted, interesting stuff at the end. So if anything, it emulates sort of the process that
Yeah.
you would analyze your data, in which you would
Right.
analyze your data. So yeah, and it's mostly like a book where we want to like give them like an early win or something like that is more a book where we want to
Yeah.
sell people on using it, like using that method in general. Like for Hadley's book, it might be somebody who's coming out of Excel and they're like, to give them something like that, like you said, is like
Right.
you get them kind of hooked
Yeah.
in. Shani does the same thing, to be honest with you. And with us, we sort of had the premise that all right, well, you're picking
Mm-hmm.
up this book for a reason. Uh, you're going to do some modeling. Maybe you've heard of the tidyverse and
Yeah.
tidy models. So now you're
Yeah.
in. What do you do? That's
So
sort
in
of
that,
thinking about it.
so the case you gave is, the bank analyst is asked by his boss or boss to do something. I'm curious what you think about. This is going totally different direction, but I'm curious what you think about making modeling too easy for people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
This has come
okay.
up so much. I have thought about this so much. Recently, it's been a point of discussion. I mean, this is like heresy to say, and people are going to be like, all right, delete now. But like, I'm really, really not a believer in like any
Mm-hmm.
automated machine learning. I feel like that is like a recipe for disaster. It's not like
Yeah, yeah.
Skynet like taking over, but where can things go wrong is, and that's been like my mantra my entire career is like,
Mm-hmm.
what's the worst that could happen? And so, most of the machine learning that I've done is
Mm-hmm.
like assistive. Like, I don't need to tell a chemist, it's obvious this compound is the one you should
Mm-hmm.
synthesize to cure cancer, right? But giving them, I hate to use the word insights, but giving them prototypes like, hey, based on the data we have, here's like a de novo structure we
Mm-hmm.
think you might look at. And with the understanding that it might prompt them to say, like, oh, I never thought about designing it that way, or or they might take a structure that they have and say, well, how would this work if we made
Right.
it? We haven't made it yet, but I'll give you the formula. You tell me how active it's going to be. And so that's sort of where I see um, the bulk of the utility in like machine learning and modeling and things like that. If we're talking about predictive models as opposed to
Right.
like
Right.
making inferences and drawing conclusions. So that's sort of where I live. AutoML is something, depending on how you define that I think is really interesting and helpful, because I think if as long as it instructs you where you learn something out of it. So to me, it's really scary to be like, oh, I just gave it my CSV file and I have
Yeah.
this published model without
Right.
knowing anything. Uh, I feel like I feel like
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to do that. In some sense, we have, I want to say, put constraints on that in Teddy models. We've enabled you to do a whole lot of stuff. In fact, a couple of the
Yeah.
podcasts have talked about some of these tools that we've developed. And like, oh no, but just saying that, like, I had a lot of trepidation in making them. But on the other hand, like when I was doing modeling for a living, I
Right.
would have wanted those tools. So we certainly don't have anything where you just blindly get
Mm-hmm.
results
Yeah.
without any oversight. And also, we put in a lot of guardrails to really prevent people from. There's a lot of pitfalls in machine learning. It's really, and I've done this. It's really easy to get a model you think has really high accuracy, and then 6 months later you get new samples, and
Yeah.
you're like, "Why
Yeah.
am I missing them all?" And it's because you made a methodology error and didn't realize it. And so we know where most of those things are, and we've designed the software and the syntax to really. You'd have to go out of your way to do it
Yeah.
poorly and
Yeah.
not realize it. So, those are all things that, that come to mind when people ask me that question. Our friend David Robinson was talking about this in a blog post about Teddy modelers. And his point was, yeah, don't let people fool you with that. You should be
Mm-hmm.
concentrating on your problem. You should not be concentrating on, is my software doing the wrong thing? Am I unassumingly
Yeah.
like making some big error? You should use tools that you can feel safe with and give you results. And he definitely felt like that was something that tiny models does,
Mm-hmm.
and I agree with him. um you don't want to get bogged down in you know am I resampling the right way, or am I doing it properly? Did I
Right.
use the training set in the right way, or the test set? And again, like when I was talking about like tooling
Mm-hmm.
earlier, that it goes into that like if your job is modeling and you have good tools, and I think we're making those, then you get to be so much more productive because you're not bogged down in the errors, or
Yeah.
like, oh, but did I do that right? uh, and so yeah, I feel like that's probably the best answer is, I'll admit, like I was talking to somebody who I knew pretty well, and I was at their institution and we were talking, and he was using caret at the time, and he said, I try like a dozen models in caret, and I don't really know what a lot
Yeah.
of them do or how they work, but I get one that seems like it's doing really well, and then
Mm.
I go read the paper, and be like, all right, so what exactly is it
Yeah.
doing? How can I figure that out? And to me, that made me feel the first part of the conversation, I was like, okay. And then the
Yeah.
second
That's
part,
right.
I was
Yeah.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, I'm happy. Um, so yeah, we especially want to facilitate people doing things that they couldn't do before, whether there wasn't an R package to do it, and this happens to some extent, there's something that you want to use in R, but you end up slamming your keyboard on the table because it's so awful to use. And so we want to like smooth all that out. We want to just make those things, either rewrite them or make them easier to use and more consistent and work well, and allow you to do things that you really would have had trouble doing before. That it adds a lot of power to what you're doing, but again, you can do it in a way that you hopefully can feel safe
Yeah.
in
It's
your
like
application of these
building
things.
some roadblock, but not a wall, right? It's like a speed bump, right? You want people to slow down, but you don't want them to be able to get to the end of the street.
Yeah, maybe the analogy I'd be like is
Okay.
going
Yeah.
off
Yeah.
road. Like, I can go straight to my grocery store from my house, go through a lot of people's lawns and get there much faster. But the idea is like,
Yeah.
but I have to do a lot of work to get there, right? And so, like, here's another example from Caret. Like early on, somebody, and God bless them for doing this, but they emailed me and said, "Oh, I wrote this blog post about Caret and how it helped me win this Kaggle competition. I just
Yeah.
want to say thanks." I was like, "Oh, wow, that's really nice." And I got around to reading it and was like, well, I mean, they weren't wrong, but they basically use caret to try to map their training set to the test set and
Oh,
make them similar as possible to maximize their
yeah,
accuracy. I'm like, well, okay,
yeah,
yeah. I mean, you did it. And we just want to make sure we don't put roadblocks up anywhere.
yeah,
But like to do that, you would have to really you have
right,
to do some interesting things with tidy models to
yeah,
be
yeah,
able
yeah.
to like finagle that. So it would be so like unnatural
Yeah,
for you
yeah.
to do. It's like,
I mean,
why am
I
I
mean, it's
doing
interesting
this?
because there are lots of like design tools now, like Canva and Figma and these other tools that are sort of democratizing design. And I'm sure there's lots of graphic designers out there who hate those tools because you're putting these fairly powerful design tools in the hands of people who don't know design. And I guess there's an equivalence with statistical packages where you're giving power to people who, like you said, they're running regressions, but they don't really know what they're doing, or they don't know how to interpret it, or they're, mucking with the data in ways that maybe they shouldn't.
And that is the modern history of statistics.
Yeah.
So no, I'm serious. Like when I was in my 20s, I was reading papers about
Yeah.
the democratization of statistics and people having
Hmm.
Minitab or SPSS or whatever. And and I think as a profession, statisticians have had to come to terms with the idea
Hmm.
that you can't be data cop, right? It's not that it's in I think there's a history of in statistics of being sort of like the analogy I use is like like a PhD in statistics is like some wizard that lives in a cave, and
Yeah.
people are scared. They don't know how to kill the dragon, so they go and they like genuflect in front of the wizard, and the wizard's like, "Oh, I'll teach you the
Yeah.
incantations to do this complicated thing and solve your problems." And the
Yeah.
wizard's not
Right.
out there helping them grow wheat, right? It's like, and I feel like statistics over the years has suffered because of this sort of inherent
Yeah.
I mean, it's a generalization, but I think it jives with a lot of the statisticians I've worked with is like, yes, I'll come and bless what you're doing. And if you didn't do it right, I won't
Yeah. Yeah.
scold you, but I'll look disapprovingly. And so I feel like data science, are as much as it was talked negatively about the whole Six Sigma thing. My experience with it in the corporation I worked with was actually very positive because there was a
Yeah.
statistician
Right.
almost every project. And so, we got in the mud a little bit and like, oh, these are the problems that they're facing, not like, should I use
Hmm.
a t-test or a Wilcoxon test? And so I feel like, the environment we've had to accept the idea that we're not, in fact, we've been marginalized to some degree because
Hmm.
there's so many tools. And honestly, I think that on the computer science side, in some ways, they're a lot better at promoting and talking about
Yeah.
things. And there's so many more of them that I feel like I've been in places where it's like, well, yeah, you're doing a bunch of statistics. Why aren't you in the statistics group? They're like, well,
Right.
like we're not, because like that's
Yeah.
how we
Yeah.
got 20 people instead of
Right.
5 people, because we're not in the statistics group. So it's really been a detriment. The cycle repeats itself like every 10 years. It happened with in the 80s with Taguchi methods and
Hmm.
spectrometry like partial least squares, and then it happening in machine learning with boosting, where we're get a little bit I feel like as a population we get a little bit complacent. We see things from outside our community being published that have really good ideas, but maybe aren't
Hmm.
really statistically all that rigorous. And then, it's more like once
Right.
you have ideas, we can refine them. And I feel like we're on the road to being more integrated and more hands on and more just
Hmm.
generally proactive than we
Right.
were before, because we don't have much
Yeah.
choice. And in
The
a way,
last thing I
that's
wanted to
good.
ask you, especially for folks who are listening to this who are maybe less interested in the modeling side and more interested on the data viz side, can you talk a little bit about the link between tidy models and, I guess, ggplot would be the way most people would go?
Yeah, so I say this quote all the time. If you've heard me speak before, you've most likely heard it. But a professor I had said, like, the only way to be comfortable with your data is to never look at it. And so before doing any modeling, we promote our workshops and things like that. Hey, let's take 10 minutes, and whether it's base R or just summary statistics or ggplot, look at your data.
Hmm.
What do you notice about this? That really informs the models. So there's usually this big feedback loop of like, you build a model, it works okay, you can figure out where it doesn't work, and then you have to do a bunch of like exploratory analysis to figure
Hmm.
out why not those, right? Why don't samples doing poorly? also, recipes in particular have some nice tools where you can do, especially for like high dimensional data, you can do very helpful and informative feature reductions. Like, there's always principal component analysis, but there's a whole host of things like that, some of which are nonlinear, some of which are supervised, that will really help you understand your data a lot better. Back when I was doing computational biology, the minimum number of outcomes I had in my experiments were
Wow.
about 7,000.
Yeah.
Ranging
Yeah.
up to about, like a million, right? And so now you have all these
Yeah.
dimensions and it's a very dense data set. And how do I know if, but you've got like 30 samples, how do I know if any one of those
Yeah.
samples is problematic? And so using these particular techniques, it gets you very far very quickly to figure out like, oh, yeah, this one's all goofed up because, they ran it on a week or two after the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
others, or whatever the example might be. So I think there's, like, if you do anything analytical, like in terms of analysis, it's kind of a recipe for disaster if you're not looking at your data. ggplot facilitates that, to look at your data, and then what you learn can then facilitate going backwards. Like, you might, in some data analysis, figure out that one of the or two of these model terms are really interacting with each other. And that's maybe the ggplot that you show to your boss's boss that says like, oh, look, we could exploit this
Yeah.
interaction and make more money, or do a
Yeah.
better widget, or whatever it is that you're doing. Uh, you really can't divorce data analysis
Yeah.
and visualization.
Yeah.
They really are tied together.
Okay, so terrific. Thanks so much. So Tidy Models, people can buy the hardcover or the actual physical book, but there's also an open source version that they can check out. And I'll put the link to that. And there's code snippets in there
Yep,
too, right? So they shouldn't, but they
excellent.
could just copy and paste and get things to run. Yeah,
Oh, absolutely.
right.
And the whole book is there, like all the source files, that if you wanted to compile the book and print it on your printer, like, I mean, have fun with that.
Yeah,
But um, yeah,
awesome.
it's all out there for you. Yeah. And there's also
Yeah,
tidymodels.org is a nice website we put together that has a lot of tutorials and a lot of really good resources. So if you like long form, check out the book. If you want more short form,
yeah.
almost like blog post
That's the way to
length
go. All right. Well, I'll put links
information,
to that
that's
and
a
everything we
better
talked about. I've
site to
got a
go.
whole. I'll have like the history of statistical packages on this on the show notes for today. So terrific, Max. Thanks so much for coming on the show. This is great.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And thanks for everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the show. I hope you liked that discussion with Max Kuhn. I hope you'll check out all the links I put on the show notes page, all the links to his books, his GitHub page, his RStudio page, all of the great stuff that you could learn about the Tidyverse, Tidy models, and all the other stuff that he is working on. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.